All right, everybody. So this is a quick overview of how to do studies in psychology. Um, so in essence, this is kind of how psychology does science. So a couple things to kind of remember before we go into this. Psychology is a science. It uses the scientific method like any other science. However, because psychology is a social science, which means it's dealing with people, there are other ways beyond a kind of typical lab experiment that can be useful for this. Are lab experiments useful? Yes. Are they used? Yes. However, there are more tools than just that. So, some things about the scientific process before we get started. First, the idea of a theory. A theory is something that tries to explain something. And often these are used to generate some form of hypothesis. And then on top of that, you have a principle. And these are ideas based on scientific rules and laws that are generally accepted. And usually this is after a period of experimentation where more or less the theory has been proven. However, though, with science, nothing is ever truly proven 100%. Things can come along and change, whatever the kind of consensus is. All right, so nothing is ever like, despite what people want to say, nothing is ever 100% proven. Things can be changed, or our understandings of things can be changed based off of more data that is available. So, the scientific attitude. A couple things to kind of remember. Um, First, person's got to be curious. They need passion to explore without misleading either yourself or anyone else. Um, Second thing that's a scientific attitude that people need to have is being skeptical. What does this mean? How do we know that we know? Kind of questioning yourself the whole time to make sure that you're not misleading. Kind of being your own harshest critic if need be. And then lastly, need to be humble. Be awareness of your own personal vulnerability to error. Because again, humans, we ain't perfect. And we can be wrong from time to time. Now, the reason for this is we have to kind of be aware of our human failings. And again, this is where the scientific method can actually help. So like, for example, you have hindsight bias. Sometimes it's called, oh, I knew it all along phenomenon. Um, where it's, okay, you say something, it turns out you're right, you're going to remember it, but you're going to forget the 20 dozen other times in which you were so sure something was going to happen and it didn't turn out that way. And then also, yeah, falling or failing of overconfidence, where people are more confident than they are right. And again, it's one of those things that we kind of remember when we're right, but we don't necessarily remember when we forget or when we're wrong. And then others is our tendency to perceive order in some kind of random events. And this is kind of you almost call it a failing of our brains, because our brains are hardwired to look for patterns. We always look for patterns. This is, Gestalt psychology at work, where naturally we are trying to find patterns. We have to find some pattern to things. It helps us streamline our thinking and our processes and everything else. And our brains do have a tendency to sometimes create patterns where there is none. So if I were to take a coin and flip it and I get heads 3 times in a row, naturally you're going to be like, oh, flip it again. You'll get heads another time, the fourth time. And not really, because each time I flip the coin, the probability is still the same that I'll end up with heads or tails. It's 50-50, no matter what. Um, And again, sometimes you even look at things like a card game where like a really, really good hand and a really, really bad hand. Doesn't really matter. The odds are actually the same. But what happens is because of the game, we actually put extra emphasis on one particular set of hands then we do another set of hands. So how to research? Pretty much the first and most common way that people think of are experiments. And again, these are the most familiar. If you think back to your biology class or chemistry class, you go through that whole scientific process. It's pretty much the same thing. You start off with a basic hypothesis, an educated guess expressing the relationship between two variables. So kind of like a bad example is coffee makes you smarter. That's not a good one. A better one is caffeine will enable a person to complete math problems faster. That's a better hypothesis. So once you have your hypothesis, you can start assigning some variables. And the variables are the things you change in an experiment. So if we're going to run with our little coffee example, it would be the amount of caffeine in the coffee. Is it straight coffee? Is it decaf? Is it, an espresso? And the dependent variable is the result of a change in the independent variable. And again, the independent variable would be the amount of coffee that you put into the caffeine you put into it. And again, the dependent variable, you would just time how fast the math problems are completed in each group. So your guinea pigs. First, you have your basic control group. These are the people that don't get messed with. So for our little coffee example, they get decaf. They're normal, regular decaf, nothing too fancy. Then you have your experimental groups. These are the people that get messed with. It's a good idea to break them up into different parts. So you can break up one group who gets 20 milligrams of caffeine. And then your other group gets 100 milligrams of caffeine. They're going to be wired. And then the next question that comes up is, would you necessarily want your participants to know that whether they're in an experimental group or a control group? Do they know they're being messed with, or do they not know they're being messed with? And this is where the blindness comes in. You have two levels of flavor, or two flavors of this. You have your single blind. This is where the participant doesn't know. They don't know whether they're getting the decaf, the eye opener, or the Red Bull. They don't know that. All they know is they're drinking something. They know there's a potential that they can get either which way, but they don't really know. The doctor does, or the person conducting the study does. But they can actually skew the results just because they know. So that you can have a double blind where the participant and the researcher don't know. The only thing that the participants and the researcher know is you have A, B, and C. And decaf could be A, B, or C. They don't know which one. Then you have your samples. The sample group is a smaller group out of the total population. So this needs to have external validity, which pretty much means that the results need to represent a larger whole. It must be representative. So you got that. Then on top of that, you need to make sure it's random. Each individual has a purely equal chance of being selected, either selected for the experiment or even selected for which group they go into. And on top of that, it has to be stratified. Subgroups of a population represented proportionally as the same. So for example, 50% male, 50% female. About half the people on Earth are male, about half the people on Earth are female. It's not the exact numbers, but you get the idea. You need to make sure that you have all the other sub-pops that are maybe relevant. Your math whizzes, or your athletes, or your gamers, or whatever, if it's relevant. And why? The idea is this. One, it avoids response bias. If someone knows they're drinking a Red Bull, they're going to act like they're drinking a Red Bull. If the scientist knows who's drinking the Red Bull, they're naturally going to spend more time with them than, say, the group of people who got the placebo, the decaf, and that may actually tip off people on who got what. Hence the double blind. So the researchers themselves can't screw it up. And the placebo effect is when patients or test subjects or whatever, um, they act it out. They act out that they took the drug, and they don't know one way or another. But if they think they know one way or another, then it's kind of like that response bias. Um, so the idea is the placebo resembles the treatment, but can have no effect on a person. So if you're going to be testing aspirin, use a sugar pill as your placebo. It's not going to do anything to you. If you're doing your little coffee math equation solving experiment, the decaf would be the placebo, because decaf, no caffeine, it's not going to affect you. And this avoids a self-fulfilling prophecy, because again, if I tell you that you drank poison, you may spaz out as a result of it, even though you might be perfectly fine. You never drank poison at all, but I told you that you drank poison, so you're going to act the part. And then for your different kinds of studies, how you can play this is you can be qualitative, limited number of participants, but they're very, very much in depth. Or you're quantitative. There's a large number of participants, but not too much depth. Usually your experiments are going to fall under the quantitative umbrella. Does not necessarily have to, but general rule of thumb, they'll fall into that. For your qualitative studies, you have kind of non-experimental ways. Um, First of all, you have what are called naturalistic observations. This is where a researcher will observe but not interfere. For example, sitting in the cafeteria and watching everybody eat. It's not, they're just observing. They're not going to interfere one way or another. Who sits where, what groups cluster where. They're just going to watch. And the idea is they're going to get a whole picture of a participant's behavior. And then you have your case studies, and this is where you actually limit it to maybe like one person, or at most a small specific group. And you're going to go very much in depth. So like you're going to rummage through their garbage or something like that. Like you're going to get very, very in depth. You're going to get in their business. Um, so that way you can try to really get a good understanding of that one individual. And again, these are kind of those non-experimental ways that a psychologist can use. And the main idea behind it is people don't live in labs. We don't live in laboratory conditions. There are too many variables that can be thrown at somebody, no matter the situation. And the idea for these non-experimental ways is to kind of see something as it unfolds a little bit more naturally in the real world. Experiments can help with very, very specific things. These naturalistic and case study ways of looking at things are, again, more general, kind of involving a subject existing in the real world and not in a laboratory. I'm going to go ahead and put this link in the description, but it's something that was done for a college class that a professor posts, and they're actually doing a case study on Piglet from Winnie the Pooh. And this case study is really just looking at anxiety, and but it's a good example of showing kind of what a case study is. But there's some others, like Jane Goodall when she studied the great apes. I think it was the Amazon, and there's a bunch of others. So again, the main idea in all this is how psychology does science. And again, they have more than just kind of the experimental way of doing it. And a lot of it, they have case studies, naturalistic observations, because again, we are dealing with people. People do interact with each other. And a lot of the things that when we do kind of go into things, when we go into personality and we learn about Freud and Freud's psychosexual stages and Kohler's theory of moral development and those types of things. A lot of these are based off a lot of naturalistic observations and case studies. So there's a lot of, again, this is kind of a wide range of tools that are available to a psychologist that aren't necessarily available to things like a biologist or a chemist, or even a zoologist sometimes. So, so yeah, these are just, again, just a short little example, not really meant to go into too much detail, but again, meant to kind of just show that when we look at things like the Stanford Prison Experiment or the Milgram Experiment, or all the other things that can be done and all the different kinds of studies that have been done in the past, this will give you kind of a frame of reference as to where these are coming from. Okay? And that's about all for this. Peace out.